Okay, so what I've got here is a selection of protein and cellulose fibres that have all been pre-mordanted, some with tannin, ferrous sulfate, alum, and we have some that are not mordanted either. So you can see here we've got the silk fibres, we've got an alpaca wool, we've got a selection of cellulose, so we've got the cotton, and we've also got linen as well. So these have all been pre-treated with mordants, and I've developed my own sort of personal code here of different lettering system, which I do with a permanent marker pen in order for me to ascertain what those samples are after dyeing. So the two dye groups that we're going to work with today, I'm going to be using turmeric, which is a really beautiful yellow dye, and we're also going to be using the native Indian madder root as well. So all of these samples here, before we add them to the dye pot, they're going to be immersed in a bucket of water, and we immerse in order. I'll just try and move it over here. We get immerse in order for the fibres to really open up and to be ready for the dye process. So we'll start with our first group over here. So I'll place all of those into the dye pot. And they're all going to soak. The fibres are going to open up in order to be ready for dyeing. So normally we would allow our fabrics, you can see here something like a protein fibre and a wool is going to repel, it naturally repels water. So we need to allow that fibre a greater length of time in order to absorb the water and be ready for dye. So we'll let those soak for a while. Okay, so now we're going to soak the second group of pre-mordanted fabrics into cold water. Cold water is fine. Just place all those in, and they're going to have a really good soak in there. So we have the two dyes that we're going to be using today, and I have here some hot water. So what we're going to do first is actually just try and dissolve a little bit the dye before adding it to the dye pot. So I'm going to add a little bit of hot water to this, form a little bit of a paste. So it depends on what dye stuff you're using. If you're using direct, sort of leaves and foliage, branches, bark, etc., you could just shred that up and tear that up and add that directly to the pot. Some people do what's called an extraction, so that's when you boil your dye material for a period of time, then strain it, and then dye your goods in that, and that prevents lots of particles. So something like turmeric is very, very powdery. So if you're dyeing something like yarn, a lot of that fibre will attach to that yarn, and it's quite hard to wash off afterwards. So when you're dyeing with yarn, you generally want to prepare a dye bar first, strain it, and then immerse your fibres into it afterwards. So we're going to place that into the water, add that to the dye pot, and give that a really good stir. You can see here I've got a set of tongs, so that's for placing the fabric in. Note that I'm wearing gloves. Just because it's natural dyes doesn't mean there aren't things that are poisonous, and certainly the mordants do have a little bit of chemical on them, so it's really important that we're careful and we're wearing gloves. So here are my pre-soaked fabrics that have been sitting in water, and they're all prepared now for the dyeing process. So I just squeeze out any excess water. And I can add those now to the dye pot. I'm going straight in, immersing that in, giving it a little swirl around. Now, the length of time that we dye, will depend on the strength of shade. So if you're wanting to get a lighter shade, a shorter period of time, and that could be, anything from 5 to 10 minutes, right up to several hours. Things like eucalypts, etc., they require a lot longer, so a really good steeping and immersion in order to build up colour. And what we'll really start to see in a moment is the difference between the different mordants that we've used. So these have been treated with different mordants. And we'll see variation between protein and cellulose fiber as well. So the uptake of dye is quite different according to different fiber types. So we'll let that steep in here. One of the main things to bear in mind when you are dyeing is that you want to constantly agitate your fabric. We don't want it to kind of group and cluster densely, which means then penetration is not even on the fiber. So it's really important that we agitate our fibers probably every 5 to 10 minutes, and then quite frequently open out the fabric as well, just to make sure that the dye is going to take quite evenly. So already we can see here we're getting a really beautiful light yellow colour, and that will become stronger with time. So whilst that one's steeping there, we'll move on to our other dye bath. So you've got the warm water here again. So madder requires a higher ratio of dye stuff. And we'll give that a good stir. Now the main thing to bear in mind with madder is we want just under a boil. So we actually want no hotter than about 80 degrees. So we need to make sure if we go over boiling point, what happens is the colours with the madder change, and we end up with much more browny colours other than red colours. So every dye type, every dye that we use, they all have their own idiosyncrasies. They have their own sort of characteristics, and it's with knowledge and reading, etc., that we kind of find out more about those dyes. But madder has got a long, long history. It's been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's a fantastic dye, but it doesn't like too hot unless you're wanting to go for browns. So I'm going to add that now to the dye pot. Hopefully that isn't too hot. There we go, add him to the dye pot. And we'll give that now, so we've got another set of tongs here. We've got a beautiful sort of rich red colour here. You give that a really good stir. Again, it is powdery. You will get sediment building up in the dye pot. So you can, gently cook this for a while and then strain and then apply your fibres, as with the turmeric. Just giving that a good stir now. And then what I'll do is I'll add my fibres directly to that dye pot. Place those in. So we're just quite careful not to contaminate. I've got separate tongs for each dye pot that I'm using. And we can instantly see that we're starting to get some interesting colours coming out, just after a few seconds. So getting some delicate pinks and some soft sort of browny, rusty colours emerging. And those are all dependent on the mordant that we're using. So what we have here is a selection of different fibres. We've got a selection of cellulose, so we've got cotton fibres here and linen, and then we've also got some protein fibres as well. So we've got some wool and we've got silk, both protein fibres, and some alpaca wool as well. What's really interesting about natural dye is according to the fibre type that you're using, you'll get a very different colour uptake. So protein behaves very differently to a cellulose fibre. Something else which then alters the colour again of a fibre is the mordanting process. So we apply mordants to a fibre either so prior to dyeing, as a co-mordant to the dyeing process, or post. So the preferred process for that is actually a pre-mordanting process. Mordanting is a process that we do to allow the uptake of colour to a fibre. So you'll find that if you dye something without a mordant, you'll get a far weaker shade, whereas if you're using a mordant, you'll get a much stronger shade coming from that. So just here I've got a selection of examples of different fibres that have been mordanted in different ways, and what I've got here are some examples of different mordants that you can use. So the most commonly known traditional mordants that are in use would be ferrous sulfate or iron. So we can buy this in a sort of a chemical, a metal salt form. and so we can apply that to our fibre beforehand. It tends to change the colour of the fibre slightly beforehand. And we have to be careful about the amount of ferrous sulfate that we use. If we use too much, we actually can damage fibres. So when we work with protein fibres, we need to use a very weak iron sulfate bath. Otherwise, we can actually weaken the fibres and they can start to deteriorate. Another very commonly used mordant is aluminium sulfate. So that is another metal salt, and this is really a useful mordant for brightening colours. So I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. The ferrous sulfate is more for saddening colours, so it will dull the colour down or tone it more towards grey. So these are really sort of the common mordants that are used. We also have copper sulfate, which tends to move colours more towards a greeny tone. We have aluminium acetate, which is used often for cellulose fibres. It helps the uptake to cellulose. And what I also do whenever I'm doing sampling is I will always do a test with no mordant as well. Generally speaking, beforehand we scour, which means washing very, very thoroughly, and we're removing any of the kind of the sheen oils or anything that has occurred in the weaving process that might interrupt the uptake of dye. What I've got over here is a selection of different dye stuffs to show you that we have the actual sort of, discarded from food waste, etc. So onion skins have been used for a very long time. The red onion skins, we achieve a really beautiful green colour. From the yellow or brown onion skins, really rich, amazing colour. This dye tends to not need a mordant, but you'll get a broader spectrum of colours through using that. And this is an example here of the onion skin on a protein fibre. So it's on a wool, and we get this really lovely, rich, intense colour. These are very dried out passion fruit skins, so they will create a bit more of a temporary colour. So some colour is more permanent than other, and so something like passion fruit will get some interesting tones and shades, but it might not last so long. One that's less known over here is annatto. That's from a native, I think South American tree, but it grows a lot in India. It's this amazing seed pod, this very hairy seed pod, and inside are these amazing seeds that produce this beautiful orange colour. The turmeric that we'll be using later for the dye pots, this is the dried root of the turmeric. Excellent, really, really beautiful, vibrant colours, not to be used in production. So the main issue with production with that is the light fastness and the wash fastness of that. So if you're thinking about any kind of textile production, it's really worth doing your research in terms of the light fastness and the colour fastness, because obviously if you're buying clothes, etc., you don't want things to run. A native example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is silver dollar. So it's a type of eucalypt. We've got these lovely sort of circular shaped leaves. These are very dried. They produce a really rich variety of colour, and you can see here the spectrum that can be achieved from that. So one of the main observations that you will probably find when you are dyeing is that protein fibres really, really love natural dye, and we get really strong, very vibrant colours, and then we get a much more subtle palette with our cellulose. So there's some examples with the silver dollar. And over here we've got some other examples. So there are many genus of eucalypts. There's over 500 different varietals. So we've got some examples here of other eucalypt and gum leaves, and very different colour palettes. So it's very dependent on which plant that you are using or tree that you are using. And something that's very much of interest to me is seasonality, harvest, the year that we've had, etc., and the colour yields that we get from that. The way that I choose to record the information when I'm dyeing is I use a dye data sheet. And on that, I record all the information of when I'm using a dye pot. So just very basic things like the date, the name of the dye source, the source, a bit of a description about that, maybe where I foraged it from. An area of interest for me is food waste and also foraging for dyes as well, alongside the more traditional and well-known dyes. And then an explanation of the extraction process. What kind of pot I used, was it stainless steel, was it aluminium or copper? Those all have effects on the colour. The length of the extraction, whether I did a second extraction, what mordant I used, and whether I used any additional additives like cream of tartar or something like that. And then I keep a sort of note if I've done wash testing, etc. afterwards. So I find keeping a dye chart really useful. This is an example of one of my dye sort of books here. We've got examples of eucalypts. We've got examples with sappan wood, Indian dye, indigo, different types of indigo baths, different types of vat, using things like black beans, so other food waste, etc. And you can see here I sort of, collate all that information together to form, I suppose, a more informed picture of the spectrum of dyes that can be achieved from those different dye stuffs. Okay, so what we have here are some examples of the madder dyed cloth and also turmeric dyed cloth. So what you can see here, what I find so exciting about natural dye, is just the spectrum and the scope of the palette that can be achieved. So what we've got here is an example. These are all dyed with cellulose, so this is a linen fibre, and you can see here the broad spectrum that we can achieve. So these will have been all mordanted in different ways. So this has been mordanted with alum acetate, some with alum, some with a tannin, but we get a really beautiful colour spectrum from that. Some of these, the weaker ones that we're seeing here and more towards the brown, they're often a second or a third extraction. So madder is a dye that we can continually keep sort of gently simmering that dye stuff, and through doing that we're able to get subtle shades with each of those continual extractions. Okay, what we've got here are some other examples. So this is examples of working with eucalypts on cellulose. We've got really lovely intense vibrancy and some much softer, more muted shades. We can see here how dyes are really responding to wool. So we've got examples of turmeric, madder, eucalyptus samples here. So we're getting quite a beautiful arresting palette here. And what I've got here to show you are just some pages from my sketchbooks and some of my areas of interest. So this is me sort of trying to break down and examine the diversity of colours that are achievable from myrobalan. So I was able to achieve 25 shades from the myrobalan. So myrobalan is a tree native to India, and we use the nut from that. It's very rich in tannin, so it behaves very similarly to oak gall. And from using different mordants, I'm able to achieve this colour spectrum of about 25 different colours. So this will be tones of grey, these sort of greeny colours with a copper mordant. This is with an iron mordant, an alum mordant that's really brightening. And so I've sort of conducted these studies on fibres and materials. I've conducted these on different dye types. So this is lac, which is a crushed insect. You can see here the richness and the intensity of the colours that's achieved with the protein, and then the slightly softer colour palettes that come on cellulose. So more examples here in my journal. Works with indigo. I do a lot of work with indigo. And I start formulating these kind of colour spectrums or colour fields where I start combining my natural dye swatches together.